Sweet. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming back. What the hell is up with viruses spreading all over the world? This is Ask Me, I'm a Scientist. My name is Susanna Harris, and I'm a PhD student in microbiology, but I have the show just so people can come on and ask the real experts their questions. And I'm super excited today because we have the amazing Kennen Hutchison. I say his name very definedly because I have been saying it wrong. So Kennen is a PhD student at, want to make sure to get all of this correct, the Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine in Chicago, Illinois. Kennen is a virologist, and then he's also a really awesome science communicator. So he's the perfect person to come on here and talk with us about what is happening in the news right now, specifically COVID, all of this other stuff. And just a reminder, this is unscripted, unedited, probably unprofessional, but please drop all of your questions as we go along. And thank you to Kennen. Hey, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty great. Thank you for having me.
How is it going up there? So I'm actually originally from the Midwest, and I'm down here in North Carolina right now. But what is it? Just kind of what's the vibe up there? And you're in Chicago. That's a pretty big city.
Yeah. It's it's all of Illinois, right? That's what people like to think when they think of Illinois. No, I mean it's a mix of things that are going on here. There's a lot of talk going along around the school and the university. Although it was just St. Patrick's Day weekend, and I know there's a lot of people still out partying and maybe not thinking so much about the virus. So a mixed bag of responses to it right up here.
Interesting. Yeah. Did they still have the river that went green?
No, so I think Illinois has been doing a pretty decent job in responding to this. So they canceled a lot of events. The dying of the river did not happen. They postponed it, is what they say. And then actually, our governor today I don't know how that works, right? Like, are we going to have St. Patrick's Day in July?
We're just going to have a random Green River Day.
That sounds fun either way. But yeah, our governor actually just released an announcement that all of the dine-in restaurants and bars will be closing for the rest of the month starting tomorrow night. So it seems like they're taking this serious enough.
That's actually, it's good to hear. It's kind of scary right now. And that's actually one of the things we're going to talk about is finding that space between being afraid but also being prepared. But first, would you tell people a little bit about your background and what it means to be a virologist?
Yeah, so virologist means that I study viruses. That's my specialty. I started in undergrad studying viruses that were spread by mosquitoes. It's a really fun word to say. I studied chikungunya virus, kind of along the same family of maybe things that you've heard like dengue or Zika when we had the big Zika outbreak. And then now here at Northwestern, I still study viruses, but I flip to more neuroinvasive viruses, and I study herpes viruses and how they infect humans, and hopefully how we can design vaccines to prevent that.
Yes, vaccines. It's gone a little bit out of the way immediately, but because you said vaccine. In the virology community right now, are there a lot of discussions about getting a vaccine going for COVID-19?
Yeah, vaccines are, in terms of any virus that there is, vaccines are the best way to prevent them, right? So your immune system is the super weapon that fights off everything that's attacking you. Viruses, which outnumber any being in the world, are always trying to get to us. And so the way a vaccine works is that it exposes your immune system so that it knows how to beat it. It's kind of a cheat sheet to beating a virus. So with this new virus, just like anything else, the first steps are really how do we develop a vaccine to protect people who haven't been exposed to the virus from catching it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in terms of, we keep hearing how this virus spreads or how it's kind of taking over the world, essentially. It's traveling. When people say a virus is spreading, what is that? Is it like walking? I know it's not walking, but what is it doing? How is it getting around?
Yeah, no, it's just like sprouting wings and flying from one place to the next. So spread refers to the ability of the virus to move from one organism to the next. So each time a virus infects an organism, like a person, say me, the virus takes over and kind of establishes its own little viral city in here, making a bunch of new citizens. But The point is it wants to be able to do that in everybody and everything in the world. And so spreading is, how is it able to go from its city of Kennen to spreading into the city of Susanna?
Oh, it's sort of endearing. Now I'm like, oh, I hope all my viruses are doing well today. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. Have you seen Osmosis
I
Jones?
love that
That virus
show.
is not as cool.
Yeah, it's not a nice one, but the other guys are pretty cool. Like they're fine. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and already got a question here, which I think it's a good thing to start with too, where Phonetical says, "Do all viruses have related mechanisms?" So, kind of talking about the spread and that your background, right, isn't in COVID or coronaviruses, but there's good reasons that we're talking right now. That are these mechanisms similar? The spread, what ties viruses together?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, viruses are lumped collectively as a group, although there's tons of different viruses. In terms of mechanisms of spread, I'd say there's two big categories of viruses. So you have what we call naked viruses and enveloped viruses. So coronavirus falls into this enveloped virus category, and what that means is that the three parts that you have to have for a virus that's enveloped is you have to have some type of nucleic acid, so DNA or RNA that tells the virus what to do. And then that has to be protected because if you just have DNA or RNA sitting out, it gets degraded pretty easily. So it's protected by a capsid that kind of closes that around and protects the DNA until it can release into a cell. And then outside of that is you have this envelope, which is like a fatty barrier that's around it. It's kind of like fat cells are called lipids. And that further protects it, but it also has these spikes, which we've been hearing a lot about, right? I know when Elizabeth, Dr. Dellery was on here, she was talking about the spike proteins. And those are really key because that's what viruses use to get into a cell. That's how they spread. Is the spike protein has to be able to interact with a cell, and if they match, then that's how a virus gets in, and that's what all viruses are using in order to enter cells. So that mechanism is highly conserved across
Yeah.
infections.
Well, and there has to be differences though too, because I was really excited the other day because they officially announced that my dogs couldn't get COVID. Which, to be honest, right before they announced it, I hadn't thought of it, and as soon as they did, I was like, "Oh, thank goodness! I'm relieved about something I wasn't afraid of." Um, but yeah, why? How specific are viruses? Do I guess my dogs don't get chickenpox either?
Yeah.
How did we? But this virus didn't come originally from people either.
No, so the coronaviruses, we think that this came from bats in terms of phylogeny. So when you look at how similar it is to other
Mm,
viruses, it sits right between SARS and these bat
okay.
viruses. But bats are mammals, which we also are mammals. And so viruses have this thing that what you call tropism, which is kind of what they like to
Mm-hmm.
infect. And that's based off of what we were talking about earlier, those
Okay.
receptors. So different cells have different receptors. And that varies between the cell types in our own bodies. So, like coronavirus seems to be infecting cells in our lungs, but not maybe cells in our kidneys or cells in our fat cells or brain,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But also, these cells differ between different animals too. So, the reason maybe it's not infecting dogs is that the receptors that the dogs don't, or the receptors that are needed for the virus aren't being expressed in
Mm-hmm.
dogs. So, that's kind of how viruses specify what they can and can't infect. And you have some viruses like herpes viruses, which I study,
Oh.
which are they like to infect a lot of things, right? Or you also have similar in the same family viruses that can only infect one type of animal. And so it really is all based off of what receptors that animal or person has and what that spike can open up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, that's really interesting, especially with the different kind of receptors and how it's more specific to the type of animal. Or I know that plants have viruses. There's so many different viruses. One of the questions that we've gotten a lot, and I think it even kind of popped up already in this chat, but I think in every chat I've had so far, is that people have said, do we need to worry about this virus mutating? And what would that mean? Is it going to be something like in the game, what is it, Pandemic? Yeah,
Pandemic,
where it
yeah.
mutates and suddenly it's just like every virus ever. What would it look like if a virus mutated? What are we worried about?
Yeah, it's always a really good question, and it's hard to to speculate specifically on what this virus will do. So what I can say in terms of mutation is when a virus mutates, this happens in everything. It happens in humans too. We are constantly mutating, right? The machinery that reads that genetic material we were talking about in terms of coronaviruses, that RNA that it has, it makes mistakes every now and then. And when it makes a mistake in there, that's a mutation. And the vast majority of mutations either do nothing or they actually hurt the virus and make it, because the virus's years of evolution has made it specified to infect one thing or the other, right? So a lot of mutations aren't going to be helpful, but every now and then, with all of these mistakes that are happening, you get one that's advantageous. So in the case of this virus, it could have been a mutation that allowed it to transfer from infecting bats to being able to infect humans. And so that's a host switch event is what we call that. It's able to jump into a new host. And now as it's developing in humans and it's spreading in humans, it's going to continually, each time that the virus is replicating, it's mutating all the time. And this is an RNA virus, which actually means that it's mutating a lot faster than, say, a DNA virus.
Why would that be? Like, so RNA, I know what DNA is, deoxyribonucleic acid. Is it just ribonucleic acid?
Right? Yeah,
isn't so it? I'm like, oh no.
It doesn't have the deoxy, right? So the central dogma of all life, right, is that you have DNA, which is this template that makes the instructions, your blueprint, and it gets turned into RNA. And RNA is this intermediate set of rules that makes the proteins that make up everything in your life. And viruses, as non-living organisms, are kind of unique in the fact that some of them don't need to start from DNA to go to RNA. Instead, they can just start with the RNA and go to making proteins. But the reason it's important for mutations is that the machinery that reads RNA to make proteins, which is called an RNA polymerase, makes mistakes a lot more frequently than DNA polymerase. And often they don't have proofreading ways to go back and fix those mistakes too, which means that you're having more mistakes and more mistakes that aren't getting fixed, which mistakes equals mutations. And so you're having more mutations occurring.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. But so in terms of having like all these mistakes and mutations that are occurring, like I said, a lot of times they're not advantageous. They actually make the virus less fit to spread between people or less fit to infect people. But that's not to say that with all of these mistakes that you can't have a virus that mutates and becomes more advantageous and maybe becomes more effective at spreading. But often it's like a risk reward, right? So you might be better at infecting like this virus is, unlike the MERS virus, which was also coronavirus, but now it's less infective, whereas the MERS virus killed about 34% of people that got infected with it, but it didn't spread very well. It only infected less than 2,500 people.
Huh. That's so, yeah, because viruses, I know we talk about them in terms of, there's bacteria, there's viruses, there's animals, there's plants, but viruses they're so complex. And I'm guessing, is that why you studied them? Why did you want to study viruses?
Yeah. Well, I've talked to a lot of virologists, and I think that it all starts by fluke.
So you mutated into becoming a virologist. That's great.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. I was really interested in genetics when I started because our genes are what control everything about us. I mean, you might have heard of gene therapies, and like people are looking into how you can cure diseases or even live longer. But when I started, there was not a genetics program at the university I went to, and there was a virology lab that was studying the genetics of viruses. And when I started doing that, I realized that viruses are way cooler. For starters, there are so many different viruses and so many viruses that are out there. And what makes them even more interesting, to me at least, is that when you think of how simple a virus technically is, even though we don't call it life, it's kind of like the simplest units of life. You have protein, DNA, and a lipid if it's enveloped, right? And it normally only has, in the case of RNA viruses, like coronavirus or the flu, a couple thousand letters in its DNA and only a couple of genes. I think one of my favorite examples is like Rabies, which is 9,000 letters and encodes 5 to 9 genes. Wow. And yet it kills 1,000% of people, or 1,000 genes. Yeah, it's crazy.
I mean, kind of though. No, I mean, it's not going to kill 1,000, but you'd have to wonder, because rabies is something that not necessarily people, but with dogs makes them more aggressive. So I wonder, this is completely off topic and absolutely false, but I'm like, well, if it makes your dog rabid and your dog kills another dog, but not through rabies, did it kill 200% of the dogs it infected?
Oh, that's a fair point. I don't.
So,
That's, I'll have to think on that.
sorry.
But what would happen is if your rabid dog bit another dog and gave it rabies, it would also die. So rabies actually kills, especially in humans and a lot of times in dogs as well, 100% of those who become symptomatic. There's no cure once you are rabid for rabies, but it only has like what, 5 proteins, 9 protein, 5 proteins,
Yeah.
versus a human who has a couple thousands of
Yeah.
proteins,
Yeah.
right?
No, I mean, so, and kind of going back to that, the idea of a vaccine again, now because it's like, we have no vaccine or treatment for rabies. I'm like, oh gosh. But I know that there's some stuff, but like, are we, do we feel confident that we can find treatments for coronavirus? Is this something that, um, is this, I'm getting questions on Twitter here, and I want to make sure to get to these. And so one of the questions that's really great is Mark in the Dark says, in the formulation of a vaccine, what sort of characteristics of the virus, as in what proteins or markers, do scientists look to target? And how do related viruses inform that? So that's quite a question to unpack. But basically, when we're making a vaccine or we're trying to track this stuff down, can we look at how it's worked with other viruses in the past? Do we feel like we could actually find a treatment for this or a vaccine?
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of really brilliant researchers who are working on a vaccine right now, and a lot of the ways that vaccines are formulated now is that we look kind of based off of a model that we've used in the past to create vaccines, especially when SARS came out, the original SARS. I liked when Elizabeth called me the OG SARS,
Yes.
right, back in 2003. That kind of spiked us into, hey, we should be worried about these. And then we had MERS that came in 2012, and so people have been working towards developing vaccines for these. And so now in the case, I think it's estimated that we should hopefully have a vaccine that's rolling out for the public maybe, or getting to the stages for the public in a year or so. And that's just because we don't have to start from scratch. We can piggyback onto the way that other vaccines were made. In terms of markers, I think that's always a really great question. And it comes back to that whole transmission thing, right? So the most important protein when we think virus is spreading, and it's the first thing that your body sees, it's the first thing that a cell sees. And so what vaccines target are those spike proteins. You just have a virus that's found in your cell, right? It hasn't infected a cell. Your body, if you have they train your system to recognize that virus before it can get into there. Or if you have those spike proteins will sometimes be released on and so your immune system trains them, the virus can infect your cells.
All right. Wow. I mean, no. This is super great because I feel like for me, I have some background in microbiology, but I know looking up all of these different pieces, there's questions about if people will have immunity versus not, and it looks like people do get immunity to other coronaviruses. So it seems like that's a very positive, outlook.
For sure. There's 4 very common human coronaviruses that cause the flu. Coronaviruses cause about 30%, scratch that, colds. Coronaviruses cause about 30% of all common colds that occur. So we're infected with them, and a little sniff, you don't even notice it. It's really SARS and MERS, which have been the coronavirus mother.
Yes. Yeah. It's wow. I really hope that we get moving on it. And talking to Dr. Dellery as well, she was saying that probably looking at a year at max speed of getting this stuff going. But it does make me feel better that we've got good virologists on it, and people are working with each other, epidemiologists, doctors. Wow, that we've got some interesting questions. But actually, it does bring up something that I do want to talk about. So Joseph Quendon says, how likely is armed enforcement at grocery outlets going to be in the coming weeks, and when can we expect rationing? Not exactly the question that I'm going to ask you, but it does bring up the good question, and it brings up really what I wanted to talk about. So we'll tailor that. But can you tell us about that video you made about, you know, everyone's panicking and trying to buy masks, and you have one of my favorite coronavirus themed videos out there right now. I'm definitely going to put a link to that in the description for folks who haven't seen it yet. But could you just kind of outline what the purpose of that was?
Yeah, you're too kind,
It
first
was
of all.
great. I've shown it to so many people because it's just, I love this form of science communication where it's so obvious. You don't have to convince people because they can see it. So, anyway, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, seeing is often believing, right? No, I think with that, there's kind of two extreme responses that we're seeing either in person or in the media, right? It's like this over panicking and like people just buying all of these things, like just stock markets being wiped out for toilet paper, which still makes no sense to me because this virus is respiratory. Like you're not going to be pooping a lot, right? Um, but to the other extreme of like people still wanting to go out and celebrate St. Patty's Day and thinking that it's not big. And so the purpose of that video, I guess, was at the time I was hearing, I work with in tight, close conjunction with the hospital, uh, just talk about all of these people buying masks who weren't sick, and masks were being not enough were available for hospitals to start using, or people who are studying viruses who needed these masks. And so I just kind of wanted to show what the purpose of like a surgical mask was in general. And I guess if you watch the video, you see that surgical masks are really good if, or any type of face covering is really good if you are sick, right? Because it's going to stop you from projecting these droplets, which is how this virus is spread, out to others. But in terms of just wearing a mask for the sake of wearing a mask, like as you saw, you get all this splatter that's still on your face. And then as soon as I take the mask off, I've touched my face. And now, did I wash my hands before I touched the mask? Did I wash my hands directly after I touched the mask? Have I rubbed anything in? So they do, the study that I based that video off of was showing like just the use of masks in a hospital setting. And so they do help. I'm not going to say that masks aren't helpful, even if you're not sick, in reducing the amount of virus that you're exposed to.
Mm-hmm.
But in the same breath, they're more helpful in stopping you from spreading to others. And so what's really important in that frame of thought is that we want our health professionals who need them, who are going to be taking care of these people, to have access to the mask. If you're not sick and you're taking it away from somebody who can treat those who are sick, then now your doses are going to be exposed to it. And if they get sick, they can't come into the hospital anymore, which means that hospitals become staffed, which means that sick people aren't being treated. You're going to end up seeing more people dying and more fatalities that aren't necessarily associated to the virus,
Mm-hmm.
but of resources.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's, I think as a 27-year-old healthy person, my concern isn't for me, right? Like I'm going to be okay. Even if I got COVID, I would very, 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 very likely be fine. It'd be like a rough cold. But
Yeah.
that's not what I'm worried about, right? I have two major concerns. I guess I have three major concerns. I have a lot of concerns. I'm afraid, but
All right.
that's like just normal. I'm just like very afraid a lot of the time.
Don't panic.
Yeah, I,
Step one.
yeah, but that's so true, right? Like I think, I think I see a lot of people, and that's really why I liked your video, is that it was lighthearted, but it really got the message across of that there are ways to take good care of yourself and good care of others, and it's not either extreme. It's not bubble wrapping yourself and making sure that like no one ever touches you, but it's also not just not caring. Um,
Yeah.
but the things that I'm worried about are, one, I don't know what's going to happen with the economy, but no one does. This is
Yeah. I'm
bizarre.
not an economist, so I can't even speculate even
Yeah,
closely to
yeah.
that.
But then, these other things of, one, I don't want to get other people sick, right? This is pretty bad for people who are immunocompromised. And do you want to speak at all on immunocompromised, or like what
Yeah.
that means?
Yeah, I think the at-risk population. So in terms of like spreading, right? That's kind of what we wanted to talk
Yeah.
about here. Um, that's the whole point of why hand washing is so important, right? Hand washing starts by killing the virus. If the virus is inactivated, you can't spread it. Step number one. Step number two is the social isolation that we're talking about, which doesn't necessarily mean quarantining and not seeing anybody, but we want to reduce the amount of people that we're seeing or the amount of people that we're seeing and spreading the virus to.
Mm-hmm.
And what's really important in that breath is the people who are susceptible, right? So I was actually going to go home this weekend and play in a basketball tournament, but then all this happened. But I've got family members who are immune compromised. So that is anything from whether or not you're simply taking immune suppressant drugs, right? Which is often given. Steroids can be immune suppressing. So those people are already at risk. The elderly whose immune systems may not be in work, like my grandparents, just a couple statistics that I've gone through from the WHO Joint China mission. They came back and showed that essentially you're at a higher risk if you're 60 years or older. So those aren't the people that you want to be exposing to. People who are 80 years or older, about 15% of them are the ones who are dying from these exposures. And then on top of that, people who have heart disease, diabetes, and lung conditions, so like asthma. And you mix that with the older populations, that's who you want to be preventing yourself really from spreading it to.
I mean, it's so important and to think about it in terms of that. And then my third concern, which I think this is sort of the concern that I'm using when I do talk to people who say like, oh, well, I'm young and healthy and whatever, I'll be fine. And even if they say, well, I don't really come in contact with that many immunocompromised people, or even I've heard people say like, well, they should stay at home, which, okay.
Yeah, right.
That's a whole other video to a new level of unprofessionalism.
Yeah, just lock all the grandparents in basements. That's completely fine.
Reasonable. That sounds good. Not at all, but you know, if people do need a little bit more of a self-facing reason to do this, is that, I mean, the biggest concern overall for me is that I don't want to get sick in any other way in the next handful of months, because we are going to be running out of space. We're going to be running out of support. And I'm not someone who gets sick much at all. So it's not that big of a concern, but it sounds like maybe we could end this up with having some of your input about how we can just generally stay healthy from viruses. You know, what should we be doing? You mentioned the self-isolation, but not other things. Are there things that you're seeing happen right now that we should just be kind of doing all year round?
Yeah. I guess two parts to that. So the first part where you were talking about like maybe I don't get sick that often. You also have to remember that we're still in the tail end of flu season, and as spring starts coming around and pollens start coming out, if you have allergies, these are all things that can lower your immune system and make you more susceptible to getting infected. Right? You don't want to have an infection. And then if you already have a lower immune system and you get a super infection with coronavirus, who's to say that couldn't increase your likelihood of becoming sick, right? And just like we were talking about earlier, it's all a thing of resources. So we want to slow the number of people that are getting infected all at one point, because exactly, you could be in that 0.4% of 20 to 40-year-old Americans who end up having really severe symptoms, and there's not an ICU bed for you now, right? And now it's a problem.
Yeah.
But in terms of what we can be doing year-round to prevent infection, right? You don't need to be self-isolating year-round and staying away from 6 feet away from people. But the key things, and I was just having this conversation with a friend, and it sounds so common sense and like stupid, right? That the CDC is like, the best thing to do is wash your hands, right? Like that's the greatest fight. But it really is like washing your hands with soap and water, I think, is the number one, and a little bit of science behind why it is, right? Other than just like, oh, my hands are clean.
Yeah.
Is that, like we were talking about, the thing with these viruses is that they have this envelope, this lipid layer that protects it. And what soap does is actually has these lipids in it as well. We call them mycelials that make these bubbles, and they penetrate that envelope. And they can trigger the virus so that essentially, if this is what a virus should look like in order to infect it, the soap can make it do this. And now the virus can no longer be effective at getting into cells. And that's why just washing your hands is the simplest thing you can't get infected if there's no viruses around to infect you, right?
Yeah. Well, and what we know about panicking too, it makes doing those simple things difficult because it doesn't feel like enough. I think about, when I used to get a cut when I was a kid, we'd put hydrogen peroxide or something in it. And it was actually the feeling of it burning made you think, oh, this is really, really effective. And then later on, I found out that like, that's not actually extremely effective. But,
Yeah.
it feels like I'm afraid. Like a lot of people are really afraid right now. And I think that that's really valid. And just saying, I mean, washing my hands, that can't be enough. But it sounds like that is the number one thing that people can be doing.
The number one thing to prevent yourself from getting infected is definitely washing hands, and to a lesser extent, hand sanitizers work as well. So there's a report that came out that looked at SARS and MERS and showed that if you have a hand sanitizer that has about 43.6% ethanol, which is the active ingredient you want, some have isopropyl alcohol also, but ethanol is really good against envelope viruses. That exposure to, we'll just say, round it up and say 50% ethanol for 30 seconds was enough to reduce the infectiousness of these viruses. And so what's really recommended is using 70% ethanol or greater. 80% is pretty good. Hand sanitizers, because you want them to be on your hands for, again, 30 seconds. You don't want it to evaporate off too quickly. But if you are sick, then the next thing that everybody should be doing, and I guess it's kind of a good thing, but not a good thing that this is like opened our attention to, is that if you're sick, stay home, right? I know like we're in this work culture where like we're expected to come in. I'm in the lab, like they still want me to do research and stuff, but like if you're coughing, sneezing, especially if you have a fever is a huge indicator that you have some sort of infection, right? Don't go in and spread it. The best way to stop it is let your immune system beat it. And once your immune system's has beat the infection, you can't spread it to others. And now that virus or bacterial infection has stopped and died with you. You, as an individual person, sorry, I'm kind of on a soapbox right now.
No, preach, go on.
But you,
oh my gosh,
as
you're
an
actually
individual
on a
person,
soapbox, though. I'm sorry.
who's ever watching this, are the best first line of defense. Like they're in cases of like hurricanes or tornadoes or something else where like you need professionals to come out and stop these things. This isn't like that. You are actually in complete control of stopping the spread of a virus. You have the army inside of you who can stop it. And if you prevent yourself from spreading it to others, then you can single-handedly beat a virus, which, I mean, as a virologist, I always think that's really cool. I get sick and I'm like, oh, watch this. If I don't spread this to anybody else, like I just beat a virus. It's dead now. But as a community, we can do that and prevent the infection and spread to other people's. And essentially, you can think of it as you prevent it, saving the life of another person.
Oh, well, that's fantastic. I feel like that's the best place for us to sign off for now, because I feel a little more empowered. I've been feeling pretty nervous about all this, but you're absolutely right that, yeah, unlike certain disasters or certain things that happen in the world where we really don't have much control, this is something that we can be taking care of ourselves and we can be taking care of others. So the last question that I ask everybody is what are you Googling about on this situation right now? What are you watching with the COVID stuff, or just talking about viruses? Like where is your head at right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to stay up to date. I watch all the different news sources to see what's going on, how funding's working, when these tests are rolling out. So that was kind of the big announcement with the state of emergency being set, is not that it's a state of panic. A state of emergency just allows for more resources to be applied to states so that we can have access to these testing kits, more doctors and nurses to take care of patients. But what I'm really interested in as a virologist is kind of like the spread of the virus. And so Johns Hopkins has this really cool map, interactive map that you can follow along with. And so it has the number of active cases, the number of total infections by state, by location. Worldometers is also, I've found it to be pretty reliable for this. And so they have really great breakdowns between like who's actually getting sick, the number of active cases, and how many are really serious, which is nice to see that like 90% of people are doing just fine with this. So that's what I've been searching on. And then if I were to wrap something up, or to wrap it up on, I said the two key takeaways are: one, don't panic. Don't think that it's nothing, but this isn't something that you need to panic completely about. It's just something that you need to be smart about. and listen to the advice that the CDC and the WHO has been putting out. We have all the tools available for us to keep this under control. The two things that are going to make this a terrible situation is if we don't listen and we just let it spread uncontrolled, or if we overreact and we start affecting not the virus's spread, but the ability of people to be treated and the ability of people to have access to resources, which I think brings us back to the soap thing. One of the most irritating things I think I've seen is like this complete absence of hand sanitizers and soaps because people are buying them in bulk. And like, it doesn't help anybody if you have all of the soap and hand sanitizer and your neighbor doesn't, because now they can get infected and they're going to spread it to you. Like, everybody needs access to the resources. We shouldn't be buying all of these things in bulk. We should be making sure that everybody has access to them.
Oh, so much yes. Well, people can find you. I've got all of your handles and things underneath you. Kennen Hutchison, which is your what? Okay, we got Instagram, Twitter. I'm so close to my camera right now. It's gonna look horrible. Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and Snapchat. And then you are Science with Kennen on YouTube as well. Cool. I think I got everything.
And I'll actually be doing an episode on rabies coming up soon, so we can see what happens when dogs bite other dogs.
That sounds really pleasant. No, but thank you so much for coming. This was amazing. All of your stuff is really cool. I'm just really happy that I had an excuse to chat with you. Everybody who's watching, definitely suggest go following Kennen and like keep up with all the awesome stuff that he's doing. Kennen, thank you again for taking your time to do this.
Yeah, thanks for chatting up with me. It's always great.
All right, you take care.
All right.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for tuning in. Your questions were amazing. I wish we could get to every single one of them, and hopefully with more episodes, we will be able to. Make sure to like, subscribe this way, just to let me know that you want to keep doing this. On these pages, you can also go ahead and let me know who else I should be talking to. Feel free to send me a message either here or on my Instagram or on my Twitter. Thank you again for all of this. And in the meantime, like Kennen said, don't panic. There's no need to. Take care of yourself, take care of your friends, your families, your neighbors, and wash your damn hands. All right. Bye.